Good evening, folks. I hope you're all doing well. This is part 2 in my series of lectures concerning the fundamentals of animal anatomy and physiology. If you are currently enrolled in my General Biology 2 class, you should probably go on Blackboard, make sure that you have the summary lecture notes for this section. If you have not yet watched part 1 of this unit, then you should probably go and watch that video first so you have some important foundations. And if you already got the notes for part 1, it's the same notes. So we left off having established some basic principles of the anatomical and physiological concerns of animals. We talked about some of the physical limitations on the development of body plans, the needs that body plans need to fulfill in the animal's environment, and the ways in which we look at anatomy and physiology. We also talked about the hierarchy of complexity in life a little bit, and discussed the basic types of tissues in living systems: epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscular tissue, and nervous tissue, and all the basic subtypes of these. And remember, all animals that are alive, save for members of the phylum Porifera, are going to have these 4 tissue types. Now, tissues alone don't do all the things that need to be done. In fact, you're not usually going to find a tissue all by itself. In the normal form of things in animal bodies, you're going to find that tissues come together to form more complex structures called organs. Organs are found in all animals with the exception of sponges and with a few of the simpler members of the phylum Cnidaria. Now, by definition, an organ is 2 or more types of tissue organized together into a more complex structure. It is common to find those tissues organized in distinct layers within the organ. For example, if you look at your stomach, you will find that it has an epithelial outer covering, a connective tissue sac that supports it, a muscular wall, another connective tissue layer that provides blood supply, and then finally an epithelial lining, and nervous tissue infiltrating the entire thing to provide it with sensation and motility. Now, a lot of your organs are going to use 3 or even all 4 of the basic tissue types. Now, your abdominal organs, your abdominal and thoracic organs, are often collectively referred to as the viscera, V-I-S-C-E-R-A, or the visceral organs. A lot of those visceral organs that exist within your main body cavities are held in place by a series of membranes called mesenteries, M-E-S-E-N-T-E-R-I-E-S. These are connective tissue sheets that bind the organ in place, connect it to other nearby organs, and prevent it from just collapsing and sloshing around in the bottom of your pelvic basin. Your organs do have some mobility. They're not necessarily fixed exactly in place. They're going to shift around a little bit as you move, slide back and forth in some species as they run, although they don't have a lot of range of motion. And you will find that most of your organs, as well as the inside lining of your body cavities, are covered in epithelial serous membranes, which secrete lubricating fluid to prevent friction whenever they are sliding against each other. Now, a lot of these organs work individually, but most of them are going to be organized together with other organs to make more complex groupings called organ systems. And an organ system, by definition, is a group of organs working together to carry out collective major bodily functions, such as all of the activities involved in processing your food, or all of the activities involved in reproduction, or what have you. Now, if you ask the average person on the street to name a list of organs for you, well, the first thing they're going to do is ask, why the hell are you asking me to name a list of organs? That's kind of creepy. But assuming that they're a creepy person like you and they're okay with this, they're going to recite a list of organs that is probably going to include things like lungs and the liver and the stomach and the brain and the kidneys. Maybe they'll throw the thyroid gland in there. Maybe they'll throw the intestines in there. Those are all the kind of things we think of. When we think of organs, we usually think of visceral organs. But how many of you thinking about organs thought about your skin? It's your body's largest organ. It's got a layer of epithelial tissue making up the epidermis, anchored by a layer of areolar connective tissue. overlying a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue, and with nervous tissue infiltrating it, and small amounts of muscular tissue to control your hairs, the tiny erector pili muscles. All four of the basic tissue types are found in that skin organ, the integument is its proper name, that covers the entire outer surface of your body. Every individual tooth in your mouth is an organ. Every individual bone in your skeleton is an organ. Your eyes consist of several organs, like the corneas and the retinas and the lenses and so forth. You have a lot of organs in your body. Every individual gland in your skin, every oil or sweat gland is an organ. You have millions of organs in your body. So a comprehensive list is pretty much impossible to put together. But most of them, again, are going to be grouped into organ systems, where they work with other organs to carry out collective functions. Now, not all animals are equally complex, and depending on the details of their body plan and the specific needs of their environment, not every animal needs every organ, or indeed needs every organ system. If I'm a fish and I'm getting my respiratory function through my gills, I don't need lungs, and I'm not going to have them, except for the weird lungfish, which does, because every rule has an exception, right? If I'm an animal that's a flat-bodied animal like a planarian flatworm, I don't need a circulatory system because my entire body is an absorption membrane, and therefore I don't need a circulating fluid to move stuff around in me. I don't have a heart or blood vessels. So a lot of organ systems are lacking in many types of animals. You, as a vertebrate, have the most complex body plan of any living animal. Not we as humans specifically, but we as vertebrates have the most complex body plans of any living animal. And vertebrate body plans, in general, have 11 distinct organ systems. And these are pretty representative of the organ systems you will find throughout the animal world. So, the 11 organ systems that we are going to find in animal bodies. We have circulatory systems. Circulatory systems are responsible for moving nutrient and gas-rich fluids around in the body. They function in nutrient and gas transport. They carry waste materials away from cells. They move around hormones and other essential chemicals. And they move around white blood cells for purposes of immunity. Now, not every circulatory system is a cardiovascular system. Cardio, C-A-R-D-I-O, vascular, V-A-S-C-U-L-A-R. That's one word, cardiovascular. Cardiovascular, literally translated, cardio, heart, vascular, vessels, heart and vessels. Not every circulatory system is a cardiovascular system, because not all of them have hearts, and not all of them have distinct closed vessels to carry around blood or a similar fluid. Then we have the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a system containing all of the various glands of your body. The endocrine system is decentralized. The glands are scattered throughout your body. Not every gland in your body is an endocrine gland, I should point out. You also have exocrine glands. Endocrine is spelled E-N-D-O-C-R-I-N-E, endocrine. Exocrine, E-X-O-C-R-I-N-E. Exocrine glands are not part of a system. They're part of other systems. And exocrine glands are going to be all the glands that release their secretions into a bodily cavity or onto a bodily surface. So your mucus glands, your salivary glands, the sweat and oil glands in your skin, the glands that secrete gastric juice into your stomach, all of those are going to be exocrine glands. Endocrine glands exclusively release hormonal secretions, which are then carried through the bloodstream to whatever tissue needs them. Example, endocrine organs would include things like the thyroid gland, and the adrenal glands, and the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland, and the pancreas, and so forth. Exact glands are going to vary from one species to another. We are going to have an excretory system. E-X-C-R-E-T-O-R-Y. An excretory system is a system that's responsible for the regulation of bodily chemistry, most specifically for the elimination of metabolic wastes and excess fluids. The most common form of excretory system, and the kind that you as a vertebrate have, is a urinary system. The urinary system is the most frequently encountered excretory system in animals, but some animals have a different way of excreting their metabolic wastes. This is not the same thing, I should point out, as non-digested food materials. Those are handled by the digestive system. The digestive system is, of course, the system involved in all of the processing and absorption of your food, breaking down your food, absorbing the nutrients, eliminating non-digestible material. Digestive systems are very simple in some animals, basically consisting of a single long tube. In other animals, they are much more complex and divided into a number of compartments, such as the stomach, the colon, the large intestine, the esophagus, as well as supported by various accessory organs that help them with their function. Things like the liver, the salivary glands, the teeth, and the gallbladder. You're also going to have a respiratory system. Respiratory. A lot of people mispronounce this. It's respiratory. But the respiratory system is going to consist of all those structures involved in gas exchange, taking in oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide. In some animals, that is a gill system. In some animals, that is a cutaneous system where gas exchange happens through the skin. In some animals, like ourselves, it is a pulmonary system, Pulmonary. That is a lung-based respiratory system. And so it's the lungs and all of the accessory structures, like the trachea and the voice box and so forth. So our respiratory system is a pulmonary system. Not all respiratory systems are. We have a lymphatic system. Lymphatic system soaks up excess tissue fluid and returns it to circulation, but along the way, it also filters that fluid, removing bacteria, certain waste materials, and sometimes renegade cells like cancer cells. The lymphatic system is the structural component of what is often known as the immune system. The immune system is not a distinct bodily system. It's a set of responses carried out by the lymphatic system. Actual lymphatic structures include things like the lymph nodes, the thymus gland, and the bone marrow, which synthesize white blood cells and other components of the immune response. So when you hear immune system, think lymphatic structure. We have an integumentary system, Integumentary. The integumentary system consists of all of the external coverings of the body. Skin, scales, feathers, fur, horns, antlers, nails, claws, hooves. The skin and all of its derivatives make up the integumentary system, as well as a number of cutaneous glands, such as sweat glands, oil glands, and scent glands found in various species. Integumentary system is technically your largest bodily system. We have the muscular system. Muscular system obviously consists of all of your body's muscular structures, or that is your skeletal muscle, I should say. All the muscles responsible for voluntary movement fall under the heading of the muscular system. I should point out smooth muscle and cardiac muscle are considered parts of their own respective systems. Then there is the skeletal system. The skeletal system obviously consists of your endoskeleton, the bone and all of its associated structures like various cartilages. Skeletal system serves to support the soft tissues of the body, provides mechanical advantage for motion of muscles, protects soft organs like the brain, and in cavities within the bone serves to generate blood through hemopoiesis, Hemopoiesis. Red blood cells and white blood cells are both produced in your bone marrow, although bone marrow is really properly part of the lymphatic system. Skeleton is also your body's primary mineral reservoir, storing calcium and phosphates and other minerals. Incidentally, skeletal system is unique to vertebrates. All the other systems I have mentioned, most animals have something like them. Some of them lack specific systems, but only vertebrates have a skeletal system. There's the nervous system. The nervous system is the primary command center of the body. All of those structures involved in taking in sensory data, processing that data to determine what, if anything, needs to do about it, and then issuing commands to your glands and muscles. The nervous system is sometimes centralized around a brain and spinal cord. Sometimes it is decentralized, simply a network of nerves throughout the body. And finally, there is the reproductive system. That is all of those structures involved in sexual development and in the production and nourishment of offspring. The reproductive system is unique in that it's the only major bodily system that in most animal species has significant anatomical and physiological differences between members of the same species. Biologically male animals and biologically female animals have different reproductive structures. There are some animals, I should point out, that are, as we often put it, hermaphroditic, 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 sometimes called intersexual, meaning these organisms have both male and female reproductive organs, but that is an exclusive feature of some unusual vertebrates. I should point out also, as you probably already know if you had me for Bio 1, that biological sex is not a strict binary, that there's a lot of middle ground between the sexes in anatomical expression. Also, sex is not the same thing as gender. Sex is a biological feature involving reproductive structures of the reproductive system. Gender is a social system involving a series of social roles and expectations that may or may not be mapped to biological sex. I should point out that in nature, there are a lot of animals that are both male and female. There are animals that change between male and female during the course of their life cycles. There are animals that are one or the other. There are ambiguous sexual presentations that feature structures reminiscent of both sexes. There are completely asexual offspring produced in certain species. And in fungi, our closest living relatives, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of individual sexes. So male and female doesn't begin to cut it. You thought you had dating hard. Think about a fungus that has to worry about 600 different sexes. All right. So those are our major organ systems. That's kind of an overview of them. Obviously, a quick and dirty look. Clearly, not every animal has all these organ systems, but it gives you an idea of the kind of anatomical diversity you can expect to see. Now, in the rest of this class, I'm going to be spending some time with specific organ systems. We do not have enough time left in the course to hit every organ system in every animal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out a few representative organ systems and use them to illustrate how animals conduct certain basic life activities, how they acquire food, how they take in oxygen, how they move around nutrients within their bodies, how they reproduce. If time allows, the organ systems I most want to get to that I think illustrate the most fundamental differences among animal groups and some of the key adaptations are going to include digestive, circulatory, respiratory, and reproductive, and let's throw in the nervous system as well as kind of the command center of all of this. If time permits, maybe we'll touch on a few of the other ones, but those are the systems I am most concerned with exploring in the time that remains to us. And in the next couple of weeks, we're going to spend time with each of those organ systems in turn, looking at how it varies in different kinds of animals to carry out these basic functions like gas exchange and obtaining nutrients that every animal needs. All right. So we've hit some important details of animal anatomy, and we're going to explore it in much more detail over the next couple of weeks. But I haven't said as much about the physiology yet. Obviously, physiologic function, the functions of various organs and organ systems, are going to be covered in a lot more detail when we talk about specific organs and what they do. But there is one big overarching metabolic concern that I want to discuss, one major physiological thing that applies to all kinds of animals. And that is the phenomenon of bioenergetics. Bioenergetic. Bioenergetics is the flow of energy through the body of an animal. Now understand this. All animals are heterotrophs. Heterotroph. Hope you remember a heterotroph means that we rely on external food to supply our energy. Specifically, we are chemoheterotrophs. Chemo heterotroph. And a chemoheterotroph is an organism that requires food both for energy and for biosynthesis. In other words, we rely on food for both our production of energy, ATP, and for our production of new organic molecules. With very few exceptions, all animals engage in internal digestion of their food through a process of enzymatic hydrolysis, that is using a series of enzymes to break apart large food particles into individual monomers. Now, these energy-bearing molecules are then taken up by our cells, which are then broken down through a process of cellular respiration. You already know how that works, possibly by a process of fermentation in certain species. You know how that works too, in order to make the basic energy molecule ATP. We are not going to rehash ATP production. You all learned about that when we learned about aerobic respiration in Bio 1. If you have questions about it, let me know. When our bodies take in food, the first priority is the generation of ATP. If you can't power the chemical activities of the cell, you can't do anything else. So the first nutrients that come into the body of any animal are prioritized for ATP production to keep everything else running. Any that are left over after that can be utilized for biosynthesis. biosynthesis. Biosynthesis is any activity involving the construction of new organic molecules or new cells. Biosynthesis activities can include growth, repair from injuries or diseases, production of gametes for sexual reproduction, production of nutrients to feed offspring, or even the production of storage molecules like fats to store energy for future use. Now, your energy needs are going to vary from one species to another. Not all animals have the same exact energy needs, but all animals do burn energy. We talk about an animal's energy consumption in terms of its metabolic rate. The metabolic rate is the rate at which an animal consumes energy. It is usually constructed in terms of kilocalories per day. Kilocalorie, kilocalorie. Hopefully you remember the kilocalorie is the basic unit of nutritional energy. 1 kilocalorie equals 1,000 individual heat calories. What we call a calorie in your food is actually a kilocalorie, not an individual calorie. An individual heat calorie is a very tiny amount of energy, so the kilocalorie is actually the basic unit of food energy. We just call it a calorie because the FDA decided that Americans wouldn't like a metric sounding measurement like kilocalorie, so they just rounded it off to calorie and called it a day, even though that calorie has a totally different meaning, and a generation of biology and nutrition students have been confused ever since. So when you hear food calories, think kilocalories. Some countries are getting to calling them kilocalories by default. I was in England a couple years ago and bought a candy bar and it had the caloric content in kilocalories. And some countries are adopting, some nutrition curricula are adopting the kilocalorie as the default unit. So get in the habit of thinking of it that way. Abbreviate it KCAL, kcals. So we usually construct metabolic rate of an animal in terms of kilocalories per day, or sometimes in terms of kilocalories per unit of bodily mass per day. In other words, how many calories per unit of body that you're hauling around per day. That can be a relevant measure at times. Now, whatever your metabolic rate is, animals fall into two basic bioenergetic strategies, two basic ways that animals manage their energy resources. All animals can be considered either endotherms or ectotherms. Those terms, if you don't know them, ENDO-THERM, endotherm, or ectotherm, ECTO-THERM. An ectotherm is what we call, a lot of times, a cold-blooded animal, whereas an endotherm is what we call a warm-blooded animal. Now, those terms are a little misleading because it implies that cold-blooded animals actually have literally cold blood. They do not. In a lot of cases, they don't even have blood at all. If an animal is cold-blooded or ectothermic, that means that it does not produce most of its heat metabolically. Rather, that animal derives most of its heat from the external environments. When it comes to regulating homeostasis, think about homeostasis, that basic term from Bio 1 that refers to the ability of living things to regulate their own internal conditions. When we're thinking homeostasis, with regard to any given homeostatic parameter, whether it's temperature, whether it's water levels, pH levels of fluids, whatever, we can say that any given animal is either a conformer or a regulator. A conformer, C-O-N-F-O-R-M-E-R, means that that animal adjusts that parameter with the needs of the environment. In other words, that that animal does not specifically control that parameter, it varies with the external environment. If the animal is a regulator for a given homeostatic parameter, R-E-G-U-L-A-T-O-R, that means that it maintains that homeostatic parameter regardless of what's going on in the external environment, that it has mechanisms to keep that factor, whatever it is, on an even keel. Now, cold-blooded or ectothermic animals, that word ectotherm, give off heat, or heat on the outside is a better way of translating it. Ectotherms are conformers with regards to temperature. They do not regulate their own bodily temperature internally. They generate very little metabolic heat. They generate some metabolic heat because every chemical reaction has some heat as a byproduct. But in general, they derive most of their heat from the external environment. That means that the body temperature of an ectotherm goes up and down as the environmental temperature goes down, and its metabolic rate goes up and down accordingly. In warmer environments, my ectotherm becomes more active, has a higher metabolic level. In colder environments, the animal's metabolism slows down and it becomes sluggish and less responsive. In a cold enough environment, the animal could go into a state of torpor, T-O-R-P-O-R, a sort of deep, almost comatose hibernation, and depending on external conditions, the animal might never come out of torpor and might die. As a consequence, you're going to find that ectotherms, much more so than endotherms, are limited in the environments where they can effectively survive. You don't see a lot of bugs outside in winter because insects are ectothermic, and they have to go into a state of deep hibernation or bury themselves deep underground to survive the cold environment. By contrast, you go to a tropical environment, you're going to find bugs and snakes and lizards all over the place because that warmer condition is way better for their ectothermic metabolism. We have way more lizards and snakes in Florida than we do in Pennsylvania. Now, you will find that my ectothermic animal, because it is not generating its own metabolic heat, requires considerably less food than an equivalently sized endotherm. Ectotherms do not need to be fed as often. It's not uncommon for an ectotherm to consume a meal and then not need another one for long periods of time, maybe weeks at a time after consuming a big meal. My ectotherm works to conserve energy where possible. They are not high energy animals. They are not capable of prolonged aerobic activity. Short bursts of high activity, sure, but prolonged activity, they burn through energy way too fast. So they spend a lot of their time resting. It's not unusual for an ectotherm to eat a big meal and basically just lie there for a long period of time after. A lot of ectotherms in sunny environments will spend plenty of time basking, B-A-S-K-I-N-G. Basking behavior is basically lying in the sun to soak up solar heat. So my ectotherms are less active in general, less capable of sustaining prolonged activity, but they have lower energy needs as a whole. On average, their metabolic rate is lower. This also means lower rates of metabolic stress. And lower rates of metabolic stress do seem to correspond with slower aging. It does seem that a lot of ectothermic animals live a disproportionately long time relative to their body size. The bigger the animal, the longer that tends to be. We don't know the exact parameters, it varies from species to species, but by way of example, I just came from the Galapagos Islands in January, where I met giant Galapagos tortoises, turtles weighing in at about 500 pounds each, that were 120 years old, and some of which are believed to be as much as 180 years old. Recently, a turtle passed away. Back in 2006, a turtle died, a pet turtle in England. This pet turtle was a family heirloom. She had belonged to Charles Darwin, who was alive, keep in mind, back in the mid-19th century, and finally passed away after like 128 years or something of turtle life in 2006. Now, that's my cold-blooded critter. How about my endotherms, my warm-blooded animals? Endotherms, heat from within, are animals that are primarily warmed by the internal production of heat. that endotherms burn a lot of fuel explicitly for the purpose of generating metabolic heats. As a consequence of this, my endotherm is able to maintain its internal temperature regardless of outside conditions. Even if I take you and stick you out on the sidewalk on a cold January day where it's snowing out, your internal body temperature is not going to fall by more than a degree or two without you getting into serious trouble, because your body is good at maintaining that temperature regardless of the external environment. Obviously, the colder it gets, the more your body has to work to generate heat, but it's able to do that, whereas an ectotherm can't. Because endotherms generate energy so much more rapidly, they are capable of surviving in a wide range of environments. Endotherms have exploited virtually every environment on the planet, including very cold Arctic and subarctic environments where ectotherms quite simply can't survive at all. My endotherms are also going to have a metabolism that is able to sustain prolonged endurance activities. They have more endurance, they can push for longer, they do not get fatigued as easily. So endotherms are more active, able to do more, able to live in more places, able to maintain their temperature regardless of environment. They don't have to worry about going into torpor. Some of them do hibernate, but that's largely a strategy of dealing with low food supply during the winter. Now that said, what's the price of being an endotherm? Primarily energetic. Endotherms require way more energy than ectotherms do. Endotherms are considerably more energy-intensive organisms. And as a consequence of this, well, they have to spend more time in food acquisition. They have to devote more resources to taking in more calories. So my endotherm's trade-off for high activity levels and ability to maintain temperature in any environment is that they have to spend way more of their time and energy acquiring energy. Furthermore, faster metabolism means higher levels of metabolic stress, which means that your endotherms tend to have shorter lifespans relative to an equivalently sized ectotherm. This is especially noted in your very small endotherms. Any of you who ever had a mouse or gerbil know they don't last all that long. The bigger my endotherm, the longer lived it tends to be. How long can that be? Well, I mentioned my Galapagos tortoise by way of example for the ectotherms. Among the endotherms, we don't know what the longest lived endotherms are. We as humans do pretty well, coming in at over 100 years sometimes. But a blue whale was, a killer whale, was discovered off the coast of Seattle back in the early 2000s that had a harpoon embedded in its body of a style of harpoon that has not been used since the 19th century. So that animal is pushing 200 years old. We don't really know how long they can last. Now, in terms of what is or is not an endotherm or an ectotherm, ectothermy is far and away the most common strategy. Ectotherms, or cold-blooded animals, are far and away in the majority. In fact, most animals are ectotherms. You can assume most animals are ectotherms unless otherwise stated. All invertebrates are ectotherms. All reptiles are ectotherms. All amphibians are ectotherms. Fishes are ectotherms. There are a couple of weird exceptions. It is believed, for example, that many extinct reptiles were probably endotherms, specifically that the high metabolic levels required to maintain an air-breathing aquatic reptile, like a plesiosaur or an ichthyosaur, almost certainly required a warm-blooded metabolism. Likewise, the high energy demands of flight indicate that my pterosaurs, my winged reptiles of the age of dinosaurs, were probably going to be endotherms as well. And it is generally believed that the dinosaurs most closely related to birds, a group of dinosaurs called the theropods, Theropods. T-Rex would have been a theropod. We believe that the theropod dinosaurs are likely endotherms as well. In terms of what is an endotherm? Among living animals, endotherms include all mammals, like ourselves, all birds, and exactly one known species of fish, an animal discovered in 2014 called the opa, O-P-A-H. I cannot tell you much about opa metabolism yet because it's not well understood at this point in time. It's the only known endothermic fish. So in living animals, birds, mammals, and the opa are warm-blooded. Everything else is cold-blooded. I want to comment on an interesting thing involving your metabolic rates relative to body size. It is all but universal in the animal kingdom that metabolic rate is inversely proportional to body size. What I mean by that is that the larger bodied an animal is, the less energy it requires per unit of mass. It might require a larger amount of energy overall in terms of raw calories consumed. Obviously, it takes more calories to keep a hippo running than it does to keep a blue jay running. But a smaller bodied animal will burn those calories faster. Gram for gram, a mouse requires 20 times as much energy per unit of bodily mass as an elephant. A lot of very small animals eat their own body weight or more every single day just to keep their metabolism going. Needless to say, this applies more metabolic stress. They have much faster heart rates. A hummingbird's heart can go almost 1,000 beats per minute. They tend to live a lot shorter period of time because of that higher metabolic stress. Why is this? The chief reason comes to do with heat loss. If I am a tiny bodied animal, like a hummingbird or a mouse, I have a much lower surface to volume ratio than a bigger bodied animal does, or I should say much higher surface to volume ratio. In other words, I have more body surface area relative to the overall volume of tissue I possess. And that means, among other things, I shed heat more easily. You know that kids lose heat more quickly than adults do. The bigger bodied an animal is, the more any given cell is surrounded by other cells. That provides a sort of thermal insulation, and it means that heat lost by one cell can actually be picked up by another one. So a larger bodied animal is able to store heat more effectively, and consequently requires less energy per unit of mass. So the elephant eats more overall calories than the mouse, but every gram of elephant requires only 1/20th of the energy required by every gram of mouse to keep it running. And it's not a coincidence that the elephant is much longer lived. Now, your metabolic rate is highly variable. Say, well, what's the metabolic rate of a mouse? What's the metabolic rate of a human? I can't give you one answer to that question because it varies based on a lot of factors. Things that affect metabolic rates. Oxygen consumption. Smaller animals consume oxygen faster. They have higher breathing rates, higher pulse rates, and so forth. Larger bodied animals tend to be slower in this regard. Things that affect metabolic rate across species. Body size. Bigger animal needs more fuel. Sex. The hormone testosterone in vertebrates accelerates metabolic rate, meaning that male vertebrates, on average, will have a higher metabolic rate than an equivalently sized female animal with the same diets. That male animals simply burn their calories more rapidly and require more calories as a consequence of this. Age is a factor. You will find that nearly all animals have a slower metabolism as they get older. Activity levels are a factor. A more active lifestyle, doing more things, hunting, pursuing mates, running from predators, whatever, that all burns more fuel. Are you engaged in mating or gestational activity? Are you developing young? Are you developing eggs? Are you producing gametes for your mating season? All of that is going to up your energy requirements. Are you preparing for hibernation? You need to pack on the fat for that. Your metabolic rate is going to increase. You're going to require higher levels of energy. How intense is the activity that you engage in? Are you a swimmer or a flyer? Those are very expensive forms of movement as compared to walking or crawling or climbing. Your food quality and quantity. Take in more food of less caloric density or higher density food in smaller volumes. That is, calorie-packed foods, you need less of them to get by. How about, just by way of another example, environmental conditions. Environmental temperatures can affect this. If you're a cold-blooded animal, obviously this changes your metabolic rate in significant ways, but even a warm-blooded animal has to burn more fuel to generate heat on a cold day than it does on a warm day. Time of day is a factor. If I am a nocturnal animal, that means that I'm going to be producing more energy at night when I'm most active. If I am a diurnal animal, I'm going to produce more energy during the day when I'm most active. By the way, if you don't know those terms for animal activity cycles, diurnal, D-I-U-R-N-A-L, means day active. So an animal that is primarily active by day is a diurnal animal. Primates by default are diurnal animals. We are primarily adapted to be daytime dwellers. Our vision works best during the day, and vision is the primary primate sense. If you're a nocturnal animal, N-O-C-T-U-R-N-A-L, a nocturnal animal is primarily adapted to be a night animal, like a bat. It does, well, actually, bats are a bad example. Like most cats are nocturnal animals. I said bats are a bad example because bats are an example of what is called a crepuscular animal. C-R-E-P-U-S-C-U-L-A-R. A crepuscular animal is an animal that is most active in borderline times, dawn and dusk, when light levels are low. That's when your crepuscular animal is more active. So lots of factors affect metabolic rate. Time of day, environment, hormone levels, body size, sex, activity, quality of food. Many, many factors change metabolic rate between one member of a species and another. But we can still arrive at some basic averages. First off, we're talking endotherms at this point. All endotherms have what we call a basal metabolic rate, or BMR. The basal metabolic rate is the metabolic rate of a non-growing, non-stressed, resting, fasting endotherm. In other words, the animal is not moving around, it's not digesting a meal, it's not engaged in growth activity, it's not stressed. This is you on your Sunday morning off, lying around, not doing anything at all. To put it another way, basal metabolic rate is the bare minimum energy required by an animal to maintain bodily function. This is the energy that, if you're doing nothing else, is needed to keep your heart beating, your brain working, your lungs pumping, and so forth. So that's basal metabolic rate, minimum necessary energy to sustain life. For humans, average basal metabolic rate for an adult male human is between 1,600 and 1,800 kilocalories per day. For the average adult female human, basal metabolic rate is between 1,300 and 1,500 kilocalories per day. Again, remember, testosterone accelerates metabolism. Male animals tend to burn energy faster than females, given the same amount of activity. To put it another way, your basal metabolic rates, to compare that to an external energy source, you require to keep you operating about the same amount of energy as a 75-watt light bulb. Now, if I am an ectotherm, I do not have a basal metabolic rate because my metabolism isn't stable across temperatures. I instead have a standard metabolic rate, or SMR. Standard metabolic rate is like that of an endotherm in some respects. It is the metabolic rate of a non-growing, non-stressed, resting, fasting ectotherm. However, standard metabolic rate is that metabolic rate at a given temperature. It is indexed to temperature because the higher the temperature, the higher your metabolic rate will be. The lower the temperature, the more the animal slows down to conserve energy. So you have a basal metabolic rate that is the same whether you're in Antarctica or whether you're in the Amazon rainforest. Whereas my lizard has a standard metabolic rate that's going to go up and down indexed to the specific temperature that it's active at. In general, you will find that metabolic rate spikes during your most intense activities, running, swimming, flying, fighting, mating, that sort of thing. You will find that endotherms can maintain those intense activities for much longer than ectotherms, by a factor of 10 in a lot of species. Now that's basal metabolic rate. That's the base minimum required for your survival and maintenance of your function and well-being. How about maximum metabolic rates? Total metabolic rate. Let's put it that way. What's your total metabolic rate? How much energy do you require to actually do stuff? Because even an animal at a state of rest is probably burning a little bit more energy. You fidget around in your bed, you burn a little bit of energy. You think real hard about stuff, you're burning some energy. Any activity level at all is burning some energy. Creating more heat in a cold environment is burning some energy. Growth is burning some energy. Making gametes is burning some energy. Repairing injuries is burning energy. So very, very seldom are you operating exactly at basal metabolic rate. Most animals have a total metabolic rates, depending on what activities they're engaged in, between 2 and 4 times basal metabolic rate. In other words, between double and quadruple the total energy needed to keep you functioning is about the amount you can expect the average animal in the wild to burn per day. Now let me think about that for a minute. Let's apply that to human beings. I just told you that the average adult male human has a basal metabolic rate, minimum maintenance level, of 1,600 to 1,800 kilocalories per day. The average adult female human has a basal metabolic rate of 1,300 to 1,500 kilocalories per day. Extrapolate that. That means that you could expect total human metabolic rates, using the numbers I quoted before of 2 to 4 times basal metabolic rate, to be 2,600 to 6,000 kilocalories per day for the average adult human female, and between 3,200 and 7,200 kilocalories per day for an adult male. Now you're probably thinking, what the heck? I don't burn anywhere near that much energy. What's the dietary recommendation? They usually say a 2,000 to 2,500 kilocalorie per day diet, right? And I'm here telling you that the minimum there, total metabolic rate for the low-end female, is 2,600 kilocalories per day, going up to a whopping 7,200 kilocalories per day for an active male. What's going on here? What's going on is I am quoting to you rates for animals that you might say are in the wild. Rates for animals that are prowling the landscape, foraging for food, hunting, searching, running away from predators, navigating the environments. That is the kind of metabolic rate you can expect. If you look at human hunter-gatherer populations, which there are still a few of in certain parts of Africa, Asia, and South America, hunter-gatherers have a much more active lifestyle. They move around more, they have to collect all of their own food, and yeah, they're going to consume a lot more kilocalories per day than you do. If you have somebody who's engaged in a very active lifestyle, a farmer, a rancher, a construction worker, in that case, yeah, you're going to come closer to those numbers that I quoted. When Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, was at the peak of his training regimen, he was burning through 10,000 kilocalories per day because of the intense activity involved in all the swimming that he was doing. But the average adult human in the Western world is not having to do all of that because we have all kinds of labor-saving technologies that we don't have to spend our own personal energy on manually washing our clothes, on getting ourselves across town to our job. We take a bus or a car. We don't have to walk as much as our ancestors did. We don't have to do as much labor to make tools and carry out activities as our ancestors did because we have technology to do those things for us. And when it comes to food, you are what anthropologists like to call a market forager, meaning that rather than foraging for food in the forest, you forage for food at Giant Eagle or your other local grocery store. Now, what this means is that we don't need to spend as much energy as you might say a human in the wild would. You don't burn energy nearly as swiftly. In fact, in the Western world, the combination of labor-saving technologies, easy access to food that you don't have to hunt and forage for yourself, and relatively sedentary lifestyles where most of us have jobs that are not terribly physically demanding, means that the average Westerner has a total metabolic rates closer to 1.5 times basal metabolic rate rather than 2 to 4 times basal metabolic rate. And that gets us much more in the vicinity of that 2,000 to 2,500 kilocalorie per day diet that I mentioned to you before. Obviously, more active person is going to burn more, but this is our societal average. Here's the thing. We are evolved around a very different lifestyle. settlement has been a very young feature for our species. In the 200,000 or so year history of Homo sapiens, we've been settling down in one place, building dwellings and staying there for about 5% of that, for about 10,000 years. We have not had petro-agriculture, machine-driven farming, for more than about 100, 150 years. We have not had easy market access to food until fairly recently. And in all parts of the world, humans still don't have that. And the point I am getting at is that your metabolism in your body evolved around the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, in which you never knew where the next meal was coming from. And this leads us to a fun thing called optimal foraging theory. Capitalize every word of that. Optimal, O-P-T-I-M-A-L, foraging, F-O-R-A-G-I-N-G, theory. Optimal foraging theory. This came out of the field of primatology, the study of primates. It's a dietary model for explaining why an omnivorous animal, that is an animal that consumes both plant and animal products, would prefer one kind of food over another. Any of you who've ever tried to watch your diet have probably asked yourself the question, or is the variation of the question at some point in time, man, why does all the good tasting stuff bad for you? Why is the good tasting stuff all full of fat and sugar? Here's why. Your ancestors, for the overwhelming majority of the history of Homo sapiens, 95% of our history, your ancestors were roving hunter-gatherers, prowling the landscape, looking for food wherever they could find it, collecting nuts and fruits and roots and berries, hunting down animals. A hunter-gatherer never knows where their next meal is coming from. It's as good as what you can find. Once in a while you get lucky and you find a little grove of trees, or you kill a big animal and you can depend on eating with that for a few days. But as you're prowling the landscape, you can't guarantee there's going to be another food source nearby. Therefore, it makes the most sense to get the highest number of calories you can out of each meal, because that helps sustain you until you find the next one. What optimal foraging theory tells us is that given a choice of food options, omnivores will tend to prefer the food that gives them the most calories for the least effort. In other words, the most bang for our buck, calorically speaking, the largest number of calories we can harvest relative to the amount of energy invested in getting them. This dictates, among other things, the crops we are most likely to grow and the animals we are most likely to hunt. It's way harder to hunt bats than it is to hunt wild boars, because the bat is a smaller target and it's harder to hunt down relative to the amount of energy you get out of it. The boar might be a more dangerous kill, but think how much meat and fat you're going to get on that critter. Now, optimal foraging theory basically says that put a primate or other omnivore in the wild. Give it a choice between calorically dense food, lots of calories per unit, and less calorically dense food. That animal is almost always going to choose the calorically dense food every time. Put a chimp in an enclosure. Give him access to equal quantities of leaves, berries, and meats. He will almost always eat them in order from highest calorie to lowest calorie. And so will you. Obviously, personal habits vary, but in general, hunter-gatherers prefer the calorically dense stuff. Fruits and berries are tastier than leaves. Why? Because they're richer in sugars. If you get the steak on your plate, you probably eat it before the veggies, right? Because meat is calorically dense, lots of protein and fat. Basically, we are evolved to like the taste of calorically dense foods, because when your ancestors are prowling in the wild, the ones who preferred the flavors of the fat-rich and sugar-rich foods tended to eat more of them, and therefore they packed on a reserve of calories that would get them by until they found their next meal. In other words, you're evolved to like the fatty and sugary stuff, because that stuff is the calorically dense stuff that will keep you going for longer while you hunt for more food. It's an evolutionary mechanism against starvation, that your brain rewards you when you eat the fatty or sugary food with a rush of dopamine, a pleasure-causing chemical that makes you say, yeah, that's the good stuff, because that keeps you eating it. Now, here's the thing. In the wild, calorically dense food is always going to be rarer and harder to obtain than less calorically dense food. It's always going to be easier to gather fruits than it is to hunt an animal. There will always be more leaves than there will be fruits. In other words, high sugar and high fat foods are the rare foods in the wild. They're the ones that you have to invest more in getting. You're not going to encounter them as frequently. Therefore, when you get them, you're going to want to eat as much of them as you can. We're evolved to do that. That's in the wild. Now, flash forward 60 million years of primate evolution. Now, you probably, if all is going well in your life, presumably know where your next meal is coming from or have a decent idea where you can get it. You probably have some food in your cupboard. You probably know how to obtain more food. In other words, you do not have to hunt and gather and forage to acquire your next meal. Your energy acquisition strategy is a lot lower intensity than that of your hunter-gatherer forebears. Also, for the first time in human history, sugary and fatty foods are cheaply and easily available. Large-scale food manufacturing and processing means that sugar and fat are easy to come by. Sweet foods and fat-rich foods are simple to obtain, and indeed in some markets, easier to obtain than less fatty and sugary options. In other words, we have relatively simple access to calorically dense food, and we probably know where our next meal is coming from. You know that. But you know what? Monkey brain doesn't know that. Monkey brain knows eat the calorically high stuff when you can get it. Because monkey brain has spent 60 million years of evolution evolving to say, get that good, rich, rare stuff while you can so that you have a reserve against the possibility of starvation. And 150 years of petroagriculture and easy access to market food is not going to undo 60 million years of primate evolution, folks. In other words, you have a whole bevy of adaptive mechanisms telling you to eat the fatty and sugary stuff in preference to the other stuff, because that kept your ancestors alive. And we just happen to be living in the one situation in the entirety of human history in which that can work against us. And that is why you crave the candy and the potato chips. Okay, folks, so that is my look at bioenergetics and metabolism. I've run a little bit longer than one class. I want you to keep in mind that we are going to be looking at a lot of things we do here through the lens of how energy is affected by them, how we obtain our energy, and how we maintain homeostasis, how we manage these overall bodily parameters. You can think of most of our organ systems as being all about maintaining homeostasis through positive and negative feedback loops to keep your biological parameters on an even keel, and energy is the most fundamental of those. But I think this is a good place to wrap this up. This concludes not only this lesson, but also this series of lessons. From here, I'm going to begin moving on to taking a look at specific animal organ systems, and I think I'm going to begin with the nervous system, the command center that controls all the rest of it. Hope you've all enjoyed this lesson. Hope you all have a great evening.